we can easily fall back into what our culture does, is we can look to maybe money, security, we can look to sex, we can look to our homes, our possessions, and we can put them in too high of a priority like our world does, like our culture does, where that becomes an idol that we're either putting too much time and resources and intention into that really should be meant for God. Hey, welcome to this week's episode of Ask the Pastor. This is designed to expand upon our Sunday sermon where you get a chance to maybe ask some questions, go a little bit more in depth to things, and not something we spend a lot of time studying for, but as we just get these questions, walk through them, and I give some of my thoughts on it. So let's dive in. This week we continued our series, Crossing Rivers. And today, and kind of over the next 3 weeks after this, we're going to look at what keeps us on the wrong side of the river. From being able to move to the lesser stuff, from good enough in our lives, to moving to what is God's plan and God's will. And this week, we looked at one of those aspects is when we have the wrong worship, and we worship idols on the wrong side. And in Exodus 32, we saw the story of this where the Israelites build a golden calf and they worship that golden calf as the God who is moving and is delivering them from Egypt and their problems. And there's a lot of great stuff for us here today, and I think some good questions that we can break down. And here's the first one I think that is just good, that's interesting to bring up, is that could some of the Israelites have been worshiping God? There's an interesting phrase in this text that Aaron says, let's make a festival to the Lord. And then they give burnt sacrifices. And it doesn't say that I'd give it to the idol, but it most likely was. But it's like, why, after they build an idol, would then they have a festival to God? And I think the answer here is probably no. That they weren't worshiping God. They weren't worshiping Him in a way that He desired. Instead, they were replacing God, Yahweh, in the Old Testament, the God of creation. They're replacing Him with this cheap knockoff in the form of this golden calf that obviously took a lot of money to make, but in the sense of comparing that to the worth of God was like nothing. And I think it's important that as this kind of goes to the next thing, is it wrong to use something physical to symbolize God if you're actually worshiping God? And here, I think really why idols are so destructive is we can take this and break this down in two ways. Of why did God be so clear in the Bible of saying, I do not want any idols that either represent other gods or represent Him? And here's two quick reasons I think we can break this down. One, look at it in the context of being written in that time to ancient Israel. That they were surrounded by a bunch of other nations like Egypt and would become Babylon and Persia and so many others that are in that ancient time. And all these were polytheistic religions that had idols that would represent these different gods that usually were then in the form of pharaohs and kings that were taking on the form of those gods. And all of it was reducing their gods to these figurines and then depending on those things to deliver them instead of depending on something that was so much bigger. So one of the ways, or one of the reasons I believe God was so clear about do not have idols is it separated Israel from the other nations around him. Is saying Yahweh, God, He's different. He's not the same. He's not just like the other cultures that come and go, but He is apart from that. Which leads to, I think, the second reason that is even more important and even more timeless than that, is that God is too big to be reduced to something physical and something so small. Some people might use things now and maybe they say it's not a idol, but maybe they have a cross necklace or they use a prayer bead. And maybe you're like, maybe those are things that you enjoy, maybe they're things that you help. But I think the question that you can ask yourself, is it an idol in my life? Is if you remove that from the picture, do you have trouble worshiping God? Because if you do, that means that thing has become a vessel to be able to, for you to communicate and worship God, and you've given too much priority to that physical thing, which is what God never intended, instead of giving priority to an eternal God who is omnipresent. He is everywhere all at once. He is omniscient. He is all-knowing, and He is bigger than we can ever imagine. So to attempt to put the God of creation, the God of Bible, the God of all history, the God of science, to put him down into a small physical attribute, an item, is like a slap in the face to God. Which here is, I think we'll do our last question for today, is then maybe we see this, and if we read this story, if you go to church, you'd be like, yeah, worshiping a golden calf seems like a really bad idea. And seems pretty obvious that's something I should not do. But I think that's important. And here's one written as, why don't we as a society see the idols we have today? When you read back in this story, we talked a little bit about this as we were getting ready for this sermon and going through these passages. You can give Israel a little bit of a break. They made a bad decision, but they had also grown up in a culture in Egypt. That was what they know. That was what they saw that the other nation did all the time. So when they came into a scary moment, an unsure moment, they fell back on what they knew. And for us today, we can easily fall back into what our culture does, is we can look to maybe money, security, we can look to sex, we can look to all these things, our jobs, our homes, our possessions, and we can put them in too high of a priority like our world does, like our culture does. And even without knowing it at times, we have this blind spot where that becomes an idol that we're either putting too much time and resources and intention into that really should be meant for God. And I think as we end that, here's the challenge for us as we continue to dive into this is, where is our worship? Is it pointed at God? Are we giving him credit for things that are happening in our lives? Are we devoting our time, energy, and resources to him? Or are we constantly letting that be sapped and pulled away and being given to things that at the end of the day are just as useless as a golden calf? Thank you guys for joining us. We'll see you next week.